What if the person you trusted the most was capable of the most horrifying crime? Imagine a mother murdered in cold blood in her own bathroom, and her children just steps away. But the real shocker? The true mastermind behind it wasn't who you think. Stay with us as we uncover a chilling true crime story that will leave you questioning everything you know about betrayal and family. You won't believe the twists that follow. Watch till the end. The house was quiet. Too quiet. It was just past noon. The kind of midday silence that settled like dust over everything. The bathroom light flickered. A single bulb, casting harsh shadows along the tiles. Cold tiles. The sound of running water echoed in the hallway. Soft, steady. But inside the bathroom, there was no one to hear it. The door, barely ajar, creaked as a breeze passed. The faintest rustle. The children were in the other room. A few steps away. They didn't know. Not yet. Inside the bathroom, the mirror reflected something distorted. A figure, hunched over, moving in strange jerks. A flash of red. It caught the light, startling. A scream was strangled, swallowed by the heavy air. The woman lay motionless on the floor, her body twisted unnaturally. Blood pooled around her, spreading across the cold tiles. Her face, frozen in shock. Eyes wide open but no longer seeing. The door remained cracked, as if nothing had happened. The children played, unaware, just beyond the threshold. Their laughter echoed in the house. In the next room, far too close. A sudden crash shattered the silence. The mother's lifeless form was left alone in the dim light. The water continued to run, a sickening contrast to the horror unfolding just steps away. Outside, the wind howled against the house. But inside, all that could be heard was the trickle of water. Cold. Relentless. Her last moments played in the silence, trapped behind the bathroom door. No one came. No one heard. Not until it was too late. The children wouldn't understand. Not yet. Not until they saw the blood. Until the house, once filled with laughter, was filled with the awful truth. The truth of what happened behind that bathroom door. It would take hours before the police arrived. Too many questions. Too many unknowns. What had happened? Who had done this? The answers lay in the silence of the bathroom, and in the eyes of the children, who would never forget what they saw. The police arrived quickly, but the damage was already done. The house, still shrouded in silence, felt different now. Empty. As if it had already been abandoned, though the family was still there. The children, standing by the door, were frozen. Their wide eyes stared, unblinking, at the scene. The officers moved cautiously, careful not to disturb anything. Their faces were grim, hardened by the weight of what they were about to uncover. But nothing could prepare them for what they saw. The mother's body, crumpled in the corner of the bathroom, looked like a broken doll. Her skin was pale, drained of life. The blood, dark and thick, seeped into the grout. The smell, metallic, sour, clung to the air, refusing to leave. One of the officers stepped closer, his hand hovering over the woman's body. His breath caught. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the horror of what had transpired. There was something off about the way she had been left. It was personal. There were no signs of forced entry. No broken windows. Nothing to indicate an intruder. The only evidence was the chaos left behind in that small bathroom. The water still ran, filling the silence. The detective, his eyes scanning the room, noticed something odd. A single towel, carefully folded, sat neatly by the sink. It didn't fit. Everything else in the room was a mess. The blood, the body, chaotic. But the towel? It was untouched. The children, still in the other room, didn't understand why the officers were there. They hadn't heard the screams. They hadn't seen what had happened just a few feet away. Their world, for now, was still safe. But not for long. Soon, the truth would come crashing down. And they would never be the same again. As the officers continued to investigate, one of them found a small clue. A tiny, nearly imperceptible mark on the floor. A drag mark. It led toward the bathroom door. Someone had moved her. Dragged her.
But why? And who?
The detective stood over the body, trying to piece it together. It was clear now. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't just some violent outburst. This was calculated.
Planned.
And the answers? They were still just beyond reach. But they would come. They always did. The detective's mind raced as he stood over the scene, piecing together the fragments of evidence. The drag mark seemed to lead nowhere in particular, fading into the corner, where the door met the wall. It was as if someone had wanted to conceal something. Something hidden. Something sinister. He glanced at the children again, still standing by the door, their faces pale and vacant. Their silence was deafening. They had witnessed something no child should ever see. No one had asked them any questions yet, but it wouldn't be long before they would. The detective moved cautiously, his boots barely making a sound against the floor. The bathroom, once a place of everyday normalcy, had become a crime scene. A place of horror. The officers continued to search, but the room felt like it was closing in on them. The walls, the blood, the quiet, everything seemed to press in, heavy with the weight of the tragedy that had unfolded. The mother's lifeless eyes stared at nothing, a vacant expression that made the detective shiver. His breath caught again, as he noticed something else. A single hairpin lying on the floor near the body. A small thing, but it meant something. It wasn't hers. Her hair had been styled in a loose bun, secured with another pin. This stray pin didn't belong. It was a clue, something that spoke of a presence in that bathroom, a presence other than the woman. The detective bent down, carefully picking it up. He turned it over in his fingers, inspecting it closely. There was no immediate way to identify it, no obvious trace of who it belonged to. But it was a start, a piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, the children, still frozen in their place, had begun to cry softly, their small bodies trembling. The sound broke through the stillness, echoing in the otherwise silent house. A distant, heart-wrenching sob. The detective's attention shifted back to them, feeling the weight of their sorrow. But the investigation couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until he had the answers. The house held too many secrets. Too many questions that begged to be answered. The water still ran, its endless trickle filling the house with an eerie rhythm. The detective's gaze turned to the children, his heart sinking at the thought of what they would have to endure. Soon, the truth would emerge. And when it did, it would change everything. For the children. For the family. For everyone involved. But for now, all he could do was watch as the scene unfolded around him, waiting and listening for the answers. The air in the house was thick, saturated with the scent of blood and the weight of dread. It felt like time was slowing, dragging the moments out longer than they should have been. The detective's focus never wavered, despite the growing tension. He knew something was off. Something wasn't right with the way the crime had been carried out. The blood was still fresh, yet the position of the body suggested it had been carefully arranged. This was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was methodical. The sound of muffled sobs from the children echoed in the hallway, a reminder that the horror hadn't spared anyone. The officers spoke in hushed tones, exchanging theories, but no one had concrete answers. They had to be careful now. It wasn't just a random attack. This had been done with intention. One of the officers, a young rookie, stood by the bathroom door, watching the scene unfold with wide eyes. He looked sick, as if he couldn't quite process what was in front of him. The detective stepped closer, noticing his hesitation. "Stay focused," the detective muttered, his voice low. He didn't need the rookie's distractions now. They were so close. But there was still something nagging at him. The hairpin. The way the body had been left. The water running, cold and indifferent. It didn't make sense. He turned back to the blood-soaked floor, his mind working, sifting through the details. The drag marks,
The towel.
the body. Nothing fit into a neat pattern. The crime didn't match any typical domestic attack, not with the careful placement of the body, the lack of struggle. No, this was personal. The detective's eyes landed on the small mirror above the sink. It was fogged, smeared, as if someone had wiped it in a rush, but there were no fingerprints. Nothing but smudges. He turned back toward the children. They had grown quieter now, but their faces were hollow, eyes wide, as if they had already seen enough to last a lifetime. They were still too young to understand what had happened, but they had felt it. The fear, the shock. It was in the air, heavy like the stillness. One of the officers had begun to take pictures, capturing every angle of the crime scene, but it felt like nothing could truly capture the weight of it. The detective's eyes narrowed as he looked at the blood once more. He had to find the link. The missing connection. Someone was hiding something, and it was time to unearth it. The sound of sirens in the distance was the only thing that seemed to break the heavy tension in the air. But they were still too far away. The answers lay within these walls. They were just waiting to be uncovered. The distant sirens grew louder, but they weren't the answer.
Not yet.
Inside the house, the tension was unbearable. The children, now standing at the edge of the living room, seemed distant, trapped in their own silent world. The detective's mind kept racing, each detail, each clue, building up in his mind like pieces of a shattered puzzle that refused to fit together.
The blood. The towel.
The hairpin. There was something he was missing. Something critical. He turned away from the children and scanned the room again, looking for anything he might have overlooked. The light flickered again, casting shadows that danced eerily across the walls. The detective walked slowly toward the bathroom door, his boots echoing against the floor. The water was still running. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning every inch. Nothing had changed, but he had a feeling. Something about the position of the body, the lack of struggle, it just didn't sit right. He crouched down, inspecting the bloodstains more closely. There was a pattern now. Small spatters of blood leading toward the door. But the real clue was something far more subtle. The edges of the bloodstains were smeared, as if someone had dragged someone away from the bathroom. But not far. The detective straightened up, feeling a jolt of realization. The victim hadn't been left here in haste. She had been placed.
Carefully.
He looked around the room again, his gaze falling on the towel by the sink. It was still there.
Neat.
Out of place. He picked it up, examining the soft fabric for any sign of something unusual. And then, as if by instinct, he turned it over. There, pressed against the back of the towel, was a faint mark. It wasn't blood. It was dirt. A dark, earthy smudge. He ran his fingers over it, feeling the texture. And then it hit him like a cold slap across the face. The dirt didn't belong in this house. It wasn't from the yard. It wasn't from the floor. It was too specific. Too foreign. The detective's heart began to race. This wasn't just a random act of violence. This was personal. And whoever had done this had been here before. In this house. They had known the layout, the routine. They had moved through the house as if they were comfortable there. This wasn't the work of a stranger. It was the work of someone who had been inside, who had been close enough to leave something behind. But who? The detective's mind flitted between possibilities. The husband. The family friend. Anyone who had access to the house. The answers were getting closer, but they were still just out of reach. He turned toward the children, their faces full of confusion and fear. They still didn't know what had happened, but they would soon. The detective's hand trembled slightly as he put the towel down. The case was far from over, but the next step was clear. He had to find who left that mark, and he had to do it before they left again, before they disappeared into the shadows once more. The detective's mind raced as he stood in the bathroom, every detail clawing at him. The mark on the towel, the strange absence of struggle, the the methodical way the crime had been carried out. It all pointed to something familiar. But who? He couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to the victim had been involved. The lack of forced entry, the lack of violence, it was intimate, personal. As the officers continued their search, he felt his thoughts narrowing. The dirt on the towel was like a fingerprint, a sign that the killer had been there before. The detective's eyes lingered on the children's faces. They had been too close to the crime scene.
Too silent.
The officers were still documenting everything. No one dared to disturb the body, but their eyes darted between one another, each hoping the other would find a breakthrough. The detective knew the truth was buried somewhere in the house, hidden behind the walls of the people who lived here. He turned to the officers, his voice steady but urgent. I need a full sweep of the house. Don't leave a single room unchecked. And ask around, neighbors, family, anyone who had access to the home recently. The officers nodded, setting into motion the search of the house, but the detective couldn't move. His instincts told him something wasn't right. The children were too quiet, too still. It was unnatural, and they were too young to be untouched by what had happened. He moved toward them, his footsteps slow, deliberate. Their eyes followed him as he approached. It was clear they had seen something that could crack the case wide open. He crouched down in front of them, keeping his voice soft but direct. Do you remember what happened, sweetheart? He asked, his eyes locked on the little girl, the older of the two. She didn't answer right away. She just stared, her eyes distant, lost. The younger boy clung to her side, trembling. It's okay, the detective reassured them, his voice gentle. I just need you to tell me if you saw anything unusual. The little girl looked at him, her lips trembling. He came right after Mommy went into the bathroom, she whispered. The detective leaned in, his heart thudding. Who came? Her voice barely a breath. Daddy. The detective froze. The room seemed to shrink, the air heavy. Her words echoed in his mind. Daddy. The wife's husband. The man who should have been there to protect her. The man who should have been devastated by her death. But now, the detective was beginning to wonder if the husband was involved in ways more chilling than anyone could have imagined. The little girl's voice trembled as she added, he was mad. Really mad. The detective stood up, his mind spinning. He had known something was off. But hearing those words from the child made everything click into place. The connection was clearer now. He turned and motioned for the officers. We need to find the husband.
Now.
The realization was creeping in, and everything he'd thought was pointing to a chilling conclusion. He had to find the husband before he vanished, before he could erase all the traces of his involvement. But there was still one question echoing through the detective's mind.
Why?
Why would a husband do this? What had driven him to such a violent act? The answer lay somewhere in the shadows of the house. Somewhere in the twisted, dark corners of a family's life. And the detective knew, with certainty, that he wasn't going to stop until he found the truth. The air in the house had changed again. The shift was palpable, like the moment before a storm breaks. The detective's mind was a whirl of questions and possibilities. Why would the husband, who, until now, had seemed to have no part in this, be the one the child mentioned? What was he hiding? The words echoed in his head. He was mad. Really mad. The detective's gaze flickered toward the children once more. The little girl's face still held the confusion, the fear that no child should ever carry. But it was the boy that bothered him most. He hadn't spoken. Not once. Was he hiding something? Or was he simply too afraid to say anything? The detective turned to one of the officers. Have we contacted the husband yet? Where is he? The officer's face was tense. We're trying. No one's answering his phone. We've reached out to friends, but no one's seen him today. Find him, the detective ordered sharply.
Now.
I need eyes on him. I have a feeling he's somewhere close. And we need to move fast. The officer nodded and rushed out, but the detective remained still, his mind spinning with every detail. He had to know more about the relationship, about the husband. Was this an act of rage? Or had it been something more insidious, planned for weeks, maybe longer? The house felt stifling, each breath harder to take, as the truth neared. The water in the bathroom was still running, the sound a constant, unnerving reminder of what had happened. The detective felt a prickling at the back of his neck as he turned toward the bathroom once more. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was something in that room still waiting to be uncovered. He stepped inside, taking in the scene all over again. The body,
The blood.
the drag marks,
The towel.
every detail now burned into his memory. His eyes shifted to the mirror above the sink once more. It was fogged up again, but this time, something was different. There was a small smudge on the glass just below the surface. A fingerprint. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there. The detective crouched down, his heart pounding as he leaned in closer, tracing the fingerprint with his eyes. It was large, too large to be the victim's. He could see the distinct ridge of a thumb, and as his breath slowed, he knew who it likely belonged to. The husband. He had been in that bathroom, after all. His heart sank as he thought about the children's words.
He was mad.
That rage, it wasn't an isolated event. It had built up over time. He could feel it now. The tension, the unresolved anger that had finally exploded into violence. The detective stood up, his hands shaking slightly as he wiped sweat from his forehead. He had enough. He had to get to the husband before it was too late. The officers were still trying to reach him, but the detective didn't wait. He walked briskly out of the house, determination in his step. The car was waiting. He had a direction now. He knew where to go. The husband wouldn't get away. Not this time. And whatever twisted history had led to this moment, whatever had driven him to this place, was about to come to light. The drive was tense, the road stretching out in front of the detective like an endless line, each mile feeling heavier than the last. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he focused on the road ahead, but his mind kept drifting back to the house, to the bathroom, to the fingerprint on the mirror. The husband's fingerprint. It was him. The realization weighed on the detective. It wasn't just a crime of passion. It was a crime born of deep, festering anger. The kind of anger that had been building for years. Hidden behind a smile, behind a facade of normalcy. But what had driven him to this? What was the catalyst? Had there been warning signs? The detective's mind raced as he tried to fill in the gaps. He knew the husband must have been hiding something. There had to be more than what met the eye. Something beneath the surface. The thought gnawed at him. What had the husband been hiding all this time? Minutes later, the detective pulled into the driveway of a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that blended into the neighborhood, almost too quietly. The lights were off. The house was dark. But that only made the detective more certain. He stepped out of the car, moving swiftly but quietly toward the front door. The silence was unnerving, the kind that made every step feel heavier, every creak of the floor beneath him louder. He rang the doorbell. The seconds stretched. Nothing. He rang it again, this time more insistently. His pulse quickened, each moment of waiting more unbearable than the last. Still nothing. The detective's instincts told him this wasn't right. The man should have been home. After everything that had happened, he should have been here. But instead, the house seemed abandoned, like the owner had slipped away in the night. The detective reached for the handle, but it was locked. Not a surprise, but it confirmed his growing suspicion. The husband was hiding. He stepped back, considering his options. The windows were all closed, no lights peeking through the blinds. Then something caught his eye. A car in the driveway. It was a sedan, ordinary, but it had clearly been there for some time. Too long, perhaps. The detective's heart skipped a beat. A strange feeling washed over him. Was the husband still in the house? Had he simply shut everything down, hoping to disappear into the shadows? Without wasting another second, the detective made a decision. He stepped to the side of the house, moving toward the back. A gate led to the yard, and he carefully slid it open, his footsteps silent against the dirt. He crouched by the window at the back of the house. Inside, the faint glow of a TV screen flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. The detective leaned closer, squinting through the glass. He could see movement, just a shadow, but it was enough to make his stomach tighten. He had him. The husband was there. The detective's hand rested on the door handle now, and with one swift motion, he turned it, pushing it open just enough to slip inside. The house was still. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that clung to everything, every wall, every surface. The detective's heart pounded in his chest as he moved through the house, toward the living room. And then there he was, the husband, sitting on the couch, eyes wide, vacant, as if he knew he was being watched. The detective's breath hitched, his body tense with anticipation. "John," the detective said, his voice low and controlled, though his mind raced. "We need to talk." The husband didn't move at first. His eyes remained fixed on the detective, a cold, unsettling expression on his face. "You've already said everything you need to," the husband replied, his voice oddly calm, almost detached. "There's nothing left to discuss." And in that moment, the detective knew. This wasn't just a confession waiting to happen. It was a confrontation. And it was about to get much darker. The silence between them was thick, almost suffocating. The detective's eyes narrowed, trying to read the man sitting in front of him. The calmness, the lack of emotion, it was unsettling. But it confirmed what the detective had suspected. John knew exactly what had happened. Why? The detective's voice broke the stillness, but it was low, controlled. John shifted slightly on the couch, his eyes never leaving the detective's face. His lips curled into something that might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Why?" he repeated, his voice almost mocking. "Because she betrayed me." The words hung in the air like a punch to the gut. The detective's mind raced. "Betrayed you how?" John's gaze hardened.
"She thought I didn't know."
"But I knew everything." A bitter laugh escaped him, and the detective felt a chill run down his spine. "Everything," John continued, his voice laced with venom.
"She thought I was too stupid to see it."
The lies. The secret meetings. The late nights. She thought she could keep her affair hidden. But I always knew. The detective's heart pounded in his chest. Betrayal. Affairs. It was a motive that made sense, but the depth of the rage in John's voice, his coldness, told a different story. "You killed her over an affair?" The detective's words felt hollow, as if even he couldn't fully comprehend what was being said. John's eyes flickered with something dangerous, before he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She destroyed me," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "She thought she could walk away from me, that she could have it all. But no one leaves me. No one." The detective's stomach turned, but he forced himself to stay focused, to keep his composure. "And the children?" he asked, his voice tightening with disgust. "What about them?"
"They were in the house, John."
"They saw everything." For a moment, John didn't respond. His eyes darkened and he looked away, as if the thought of his children, of their trauma, hadn't even crossed his mind. "They'll forget," John said, his voice flat, dismissive. "Kids are resilient. They won't remember." The detective couldn't believe what he was hearing. The coldness in John's words, his complete disregard for the children's pain, it was monstrous. John leaned back in the couch, his posture relaxed now, almost casual. "I did what I had to do. You can call it whatever you want, but she was going to ruin everything. And she wasn't going to take my family down with her." The detective felt a wave of disgust wash over him. This wasn't just a crime of passion. It was calculated.
Cold.
Methodical. "You're sick," the detective muttered under his breath, more to himself than to John. John's gaze snapped back to him, and for the first time, There was a flicker of something, anger, maybe, or frustration. "You don't understand," John said, his voice rising. "You don't get it. She had to be stopped. She was destroying everything I built, everything we had. And I gave her everything." The detective's mind raced, the pieces falling into place. The affair wasn't just an affair, it was a betrayal that John couldn't accept. He couldn't lose control. Not over her, not over his family. But what about the children? The detective's heart sank. What kind of father, what kind of man, could justify something so vile, so utterly cruel? John stood up suddenly, his movements quick and jerky. His eyes were wild now, desperate. "You don't get to judge me. You have no idea what it's like to lose everything. To watch someone take everything you love and tear it apart." The detective stood his ground, his pulse quickening as John took a step closer. "I'll make you a deal," John said, his voice eerily calm again. "You leave me to go back to my family, and I'll tell you everything. The truth. All of it." The detective didn't respond right away. He couldn't. The words seemed to freeze in his throat. John wasn't just trying to evade justice. He was trying to manipulate the situation, to control the narrative.
He still
thought he could win, that he could keep his family even after everything he had done. But there was no escaping the truth now. "I'm not leaving," the detective finally said, his voice steady but firm. "And neither are you." He moved swiftly, pulling out his cuffs. John's eyes widened, and for the first time, the mask slipped. There was fear, real fear, in his eyes. But it was too late. The detective grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "You're under arrest for the murder of your wife," he said, his voice cold. John's defiance crumbled in an instant. He looked around the room, his face suddenly vulnerable, as if he were seeing everything for the first time. His shoulders sagged, and he sank to his knees. For a moment, the house was silent. But the truth had been exposed. And there was no going back. The detective could hear the sirens now, closer, as if they too knew that this chapter was coming to an end. And yet, in the quiet aftermath, there was still one lingering question in the detective's mind. What else had John done? What other secrets were hidden in the darkness? The detective stood still for a moment, watching as John crumpled to his knees, his face a twisted mask of disbelief. For a moment, it was as if the world had slowed. The room felt smaller, the air denser, and the weight of everything, of the murder, of the children, of the lies, settled around the detective like a heavy fog. John's breath was shaky now, his shoulders trembling, and the detective couldn't help but feel the faintest flicker of pity. But that feeling was brief. It vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the cold reality of what John had done. The life he had taken. The innocence he had destroyed. The detective watched John for a long moment, his hand resting on his gun, just in case. He had seen this before, criminals breaking down, trying to hold on to any shred of dignity they could manage. But John wasn't going to get the chance to twist the narrative any longer. His game was over. "You're not going to talk your way out of this," the detective said, his voice low and firm. John's eyes shot up, and for a brief instant, the anger that had been buried inside him flared once more. "I didn't do it," he yelled, his voice cracking. "You don't know her. You don't know what she did to me." But the detective remained unmoved. "I know enough, John." As the sirens outside grew louder, John's expression shifted again, his defiance wilting as he realized the reality of the situation. The door flew open, and 2 officers rushed inside, their eyes locking on John. "We've got him," the detective said to them, nodding. The officers moved in quickly, cuffing John and hauling him to his feet. John didn't resist. There was no fight left in him, only the hollow, resigned look of a man who knew the jig was up. The detective stepped aside, allowing them to lead John out of the house. His mind still raced, processing everything. How a man who had promised to protect and love his family could turn so monstrous, so twisted. It was almost too hard to fathom. Almost. The children were still in the living room, too silent, too still. The detective glanced at them, feeling the weight of their gaze. He couldn't shake the image of their faces. Young. Innocent. Caught in a nightmare they didn't deserve. He approached them slowly, not sure what to say, what could possibly make them feel safe again. "Hey," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been all day. "I know you're scared, but everything's going to be okay now." The little boy clung to his sister, hiding his face against her shoulder. The older girl, the one who had spoken about her father's anger, looked up at the detective, her wide eyes filled with confusion and sorrow. The detective crouched down to her level, his heart aching. "Do you remember what happened? Can you tell me more about your mom? Your dad?" She shook her head, tears starting to fill her eyes. "I don't want to talk about it. I'm scared." The detective nodded, his expression softening. "I understand. You don't have to say anything more right now. But I need you to know something. You're safe. We'll take care of you." The little girl didn't respond. She just clung to her brother, seeking comfort in his small arms. The detective's heart sank as he stood up, looking back toward the door. The officers were escorting John out, his head hung low, his body slumped. There was no redemption for him. No last-minute confession. The truth had already been exposed. But there was something still hanging in the air, the question of why. Why had John done it? Why had he taken such a drastic, violent step? The detective thought about the affair, about the lies, about the betrayal. But it was more than that. There was something deeper at play here. And as the last of the officers filed out of the house, the detective felt it, a growing unease, a sense that there was still a thread left dangling. Something else, something darker, that hadn't come to light yet. But for now, there was nothing more to be done. The family was safe. The murderer was caught. And yet, in the quiet aftermath of it all, the detective couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. The detective stood at the door, watching as John was led away in handcuffs. His eyes were fixed on the man, now broken, shuffling away like a shell of the person he used to be. It was clear John wasn't going to resist anymore. The hard shell of bravado, the cruel words, the lies, it had all cracked under the weight of the truth. But as the officers drove away, taking John to the station, the detective couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something still wasn't right. He turned back to the children, their small forms huddled together on the couch. The house felt eerily quiet now, without the tension of the crime hanging over it. But that silence was hollow. Empty. It was the kind of silence that made you ask questions you weren't sure you wanted answers to. The detective sat down across from the children, his face softening with a tired sort of compassion. "Hey," he said gently, trying to ease their fears. "I know today has been scary, but I need you to listen. Your mom, she loved you both very much, and she would have wanted you to be safe." The girl, her face streaked with tears, looked up at him. She didn't say anything, just nodded, but her eyes were searching. Searching for something the detective couldn't give her. "The bad man can't hurt you anymore," the detective continued. "You're going to be okay." The boy, still clinging to his sister, looked at the detective with wide eyes. His silence was unsettling. The detective knew it wasn't just fear. There was something else in his gaze, something deeper, something he hadn't said. Before the detective could speak again, the doorbell rang. He stood up quickly, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. Who else could be here? Everyone had been cleared from the scene. With a glance at the children, he walked toward the door, his hand instinctively resting on his weapon as he opened it. A woman stood on the doorstep, her face pale, her eyes frantic. "Detective, please," her voice broke, and her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the doorframe. I'm Jennifer. I'm John's sister. I need to speak with you." The detective's mind froze. John's sister? He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for this. But he knew he had no choice but to let her in. He stepped aside, allowing her into the house. Her eyes darted around, clearly noticing the tension in the air, the absence of the husband, the children curled up in the corner. "I need to know everything," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "I need to know what happened to my brother, to his wife. What did he do?" The detective led her to the living room, his mind racing as he glanced at the children, still silent in their corner. "You should sit down," he said gently. "I think you need to hear what happened." Jennifer sank into the chair opposite the children, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked as though she were trying to process the reality of the situation, as though she were still in denial. The detective glanced at her, his expression hardening. "Your brother murdered his wife, Jennifer. He murdered her in cold blood. And now he's been arrested." She recoiled, as if the words themselves had struck her like a physical blow. Her hands flew to her mouth, but no sound came out. She stared at the detective, her face twisted in disbelief. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "John?"
No.
He wouldn't. He couldn't. But the detective could see it in her eyes now. She was beginning to understand. The truth was sinking in, and it was shattering her. "He did," the detective said softly, his voice unwavering. "He killed her. And he did it in the bathroom. With no struggle. He was angry, Jennifer. He was angry over an affair. He couldn't let go of the betrayal." Jennifer's face contorted as she covered her face with her hands. She was shaking now, as if the realization had hit her all at once. I never saw it," she whispered through her sobs. "I never saw the rage. I never saw this side of him." The detective could see the guilt in her eyes now. Guilt that she hadn't known. That she hadn't been able to see the monster her brother had become. The children remained silent, unmoving. But then, the girl looked up, her eyes filled with confusion and pain. She glanced at her aunt for a long moment before speaking in a small voice. "Aunt Jennifer," she said softly, "why did he hurt Mommy?" Jennifer froze. Her hands shook violently, her breath catching in her throat. The words hit her like a punch, and she looked at her niece, trying to find the words to explain something that couldn't be explained. The detective watched as Jennifer's face crumpled, as the weight of the question pressed down on her. "I don't know, sweetheart," Jennifer whispered, tears flowing freely now. "I don't know." And in that moment, the detective felt the full force of the devastation that had unfolded in this house. The shattered family, the broken lives, the twisted choices that had led to this nightmare. But even with the answers, even with John in custody, the question lingered. Why had it all gone so wrong? And as Jennifer wept, the detective felt that sense of unease again, the one that had been following him from the beginning. Something else was still missing. Something bigger, darker, deeper. But for now, he would let Jennifer grieve, and he would leave the rest for tomorrow. The days that followed were filled with an unsettling stillness. John was behind bars, the children were placed into temporary care, and the investigation continued. But the detective could never quite shake the feeling that there was something more to the case. Something still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. Jennifer stayed in the house for a few days after everything happened, trying to pick up the broken pieces. She rarely spoke to the media, but there was always a lingering sadness in her eyes when she spoke about her brother. The same sadness she had when talking about her sister-in-law. The truth had shattered more than just John's family. It had shattered Jennifer's understanding of her brother, the man she thought she knew. The detective sat at his desk late one evening, a cup of lukewarm coffee cooling beside him. His eyes scanned the case files once again. He had interviewed neighbors, friends, and co-workers. He had scoured the house for every clue, every piece of evidence. But something wasn't adding up. John's alibi had never fully checked out. There was always a gap in the timeline, moments where John couldn't account for his whereabouts. The detective had dismissed it initially, chalking it up to the confusion of the events. But now, with everything settled, John's arrest, the media frenzy, the grieving family, it became clear. There was more.
The phone rang.
The detective picked it up, still half focused on the files in front of him. But then the voice on the other end stopped him in his tracks. "Detective, we've got a breakthrough." The detective's heart raced. "What is it?" "Remember the security footage you asked us to check from the neighbor's house? We found something." The detective leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "What did you find?"
There was a long pause on the line.
"John wasn't alone that night," the voice said. "Someone else was with him." The detective's blood ran cold. "Who?" The voice hesitated, then spoke the name that made everything fall into place. It was Jennifer. The line went dead. The detective sat there, stunned, the files scattered across his desk, his mind reeling. Jennifer, John's sister? She had been involved? He had never suspected her. But the truth, as it often does, twisted and turned in ways no one could have predicted. The case was far from over. It was only just beginning. The detective stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the phone call pressed down on him, the revelation hitting him like a brick. Jennifer, John's own sister, had been involved in the murder. The very person who had come to him with tears in her eyes, asking for answers, had been hiding her own dark secrets. He didn't waste any time. Within minutes, he was on his way to Jennifer's house. The air felt heavy with every passing second, every moment filled with anticipation. What would he find when he arrived? How deep did this go? His mind spun with questions, but one thing was certain. The truth had only been partially revealed. And now, it was time to uncover the full extent of the lies. When he arrived, Jennifer was sitting on her porch, staring out at the darkening sky. She looked up when the detective approached, her eyes wide, the guilt evident in her expression. She knew this moment was coming. "Jennifer," the detective said, his voice low but steady. "We need to talk." She didn't say anything, just nodded, her face pale. Her hands trembled in her lap as she motioned for him to sit. He took the seat beside her, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know it was you," he said bluntly. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a long moment, she didn't respond. But the silence between them was unbearable. "Why, Jennifer?" The detective's voice cracked slightly, but he regained his composure. "Why help your brother? After everything?" Jennifer's lips trembled, and finally, she spoke. "I didn't want to lose him," she whispered. He was my brother. But I saw the anger in him, the rage. And when he told me what he planned to do, I didn't know how to stop him. I couldn't. I was afraid." She wiped her eyes, her face twisted in anguish. "I thought if I helped him, if I covered for him, it would all go away. But it didn't. It only made things worse. And now, I can't undo what I've done. I can't undo what we've done." The detective sat silently, processing her words. The betrayal was so deep, so layered, that it was hard to fully grasp. John had been the one to kill his wife, but Jennifer had been the one to help him escape the consequences. The detective exhaled slowly, the truth now weighing heavily on both of them. "I can't change the past, Jennifer," he said softly. "But you can help make things right. You can start by telling me everything. Every detail.
What happened that night?
And why you chose to help him." Jennifer nodded, tears rolling down her face. She knew the gravity of her confession, and she knew it wouldn't bring the peace they all so desperately wanted. But perhaps, just maybe, it would bring them closer to healing, to closure. The detective leaned forward, his voice gentle yet firm. "It's not too late to make it right. But you have to tell me everything." For a long moment, Jennifer hesitated, her eyes filled with regret. Then, with a deep breath, she began to speak. The words came slowly, carefully, as if each one was a confession or release. She explained everything. How she had been there when John decided to kill his wife, how she had helped him cover up the crime, how she had lied to the police, to everyone, and how, in the end, the guilt had eaten her alive. As she spoke, The detective's mind raced. This was no longer just a case of murder. It was a tangled web of lies, manipulation, and fear. When Jennifer finished, she looked at him, her face drained of color. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant for anyone to get hurt." The detective nodded slowly, his expression somber. "I know you didn't, but that's the reality now. And we'll deal with it." Jennifer stood up, her body trembling, and the detective followed suit. He had his answers. The pieces of the puzzle were finally in place. As he walked out of the house, the weight of the case hung heavily on him. The family was broken, destroyed by their own actions. The children, the innocent victims of their parents' choices, would never be the same. And while John and Jennifer would face justice, the scars left behind would never truly heal. But sometimes, justice wasn't about healing, it was about uncovering the truth, no matter how dark it was. And now, the truth had been laid bare. The detective glanced up at the night sky, the stars distant and cold, as if they too bore witness to the tragedy. He could only hope that, someday, the children would find peace. The peace that their parents could never provide.